Welcome to the Department of Environmental Quality's information session on the extended private well sampling being conducted in New Hanover, Brunswick, Columbus, and Pender counties, also referred to as the Lower Cape Fear. I am Heather Standish, Hazardous Waste Section Chief with the Department of Environmental Quality, Division of Waste Management. We appreciate everyone's time and attention this evening. During this session, all participants will be muted. If you would like to ask questions, please submit your questions in the chat box at any time. Chat submissions will only be seen by the panel. We will attempt to address each question during the question and answer session following the presentations. To send a chat message, open the chat panel, enter your message, and press enter. Technical support will also be addressed through the chat. This session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available after the session through our website. The purpose of this information session is to inform the community about the expanded well sampling eligibility, provide background information on why the well sampling is occurring, provide an explanation on why the areas included in this effort have expanded, provide information on health impacts related to PFAS, and address community concerns. Chemours has sent out letters to residences in the subject area, and these letters were sent out with the intent to identify properties where the primary source of drinking water is well water and offer to sample those wells. Residents in the expanded area interested in having their wells sampled should call Chemours at 910-678-1100. Sorry, next slide. And you can see at the top there the number to call for Chemours and a link to the website. Let's see. Okay, the agenda this evening includes 3 presentations totaling around 35 minutes, followed by a 40-minute question and answer session. Now I will introduce the presenters. The first presentation will be given by Michael Scott, the Director of the Department of Environmental Quality's Division of Waste Management. He will be providing an overview of how we got here. The second presentation will be given by Jared Wilson, the Environmental Program Analyst with the Office of the Secretary. He will be providing an explanation of the extended sampling area. The third presentation will be given by Kennedy Holt, Environmental Toxicologist with the Division of Public Health within the Department of Health and Human Services. He will be presenting on health impacts related to PFAS. Additional staff are present on the call providing support. This includes Catherine Lucas, Public Information Officer with the Department of Environmental Quality, Rebecca Funderburg, Environmental Program Consultant with the Division of Waste Management, and Jessica Monty, Environmental Program Consultant with the Division of Waste Management. After the presentations, there will be a question and answer session. Please enter questions into the chat. Now we will start with the first presentation, an overview of how we got here, presented by Michael Scott.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Heather, and we appreciate everyone joining us this evening. Like Heather said, we're going to give some background information this evening on how we got to this point. We're going to touch on PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and a specific PFAS, Gen X, that comes from the Chemours plant in Bladen County, North Carolina, and unfortunately entered the Cape Fear River and has impacted counties downriver from the Fayetteville work site where Chemours operates. We're going to talk about groundwater sampling this evening, how impacts to groundwater and private wells lead to alternate water options and what those look like, and also provide some additional information. As Heather mentioned, Jared will dive in deeper on where we are with private well sampling in the Lower Cape Fear region, and Kennedy Holt has joined us to talk about some of the health impacts related to PFAS. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with the background of PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and that specific PFAS Gen X that originates from the Chemours plant in Bladen County, North Carolina, next to the Cape Fear River, Gen X is actually a trade name for a man-made, virtually unregulated chemical used in manufacturing and nonstick coatings and for other purposes. It's part of a larger family of man-made, that's important here, not naturally occurring compounds that are produced and have been emitted by the Chemours company, formerly DuPont. These compounds have unfortunately been discharged and entered into the Cape Fear River and impacted counties downriver from the Bladen County site. When it comes to this family of compounds, they're often referred to as emerging compounds. There's often specific or limited information on them when it comes to the environmental regulatory scope. North Carolina has moved forward with set groundwater standards for 3 of these PFAS, GenX, PFOA, and PFOS, but there are many others in this family of compounds. There's also little known how they actually behave in the environment, how they move through soil, interact with the soil groundwater interface, and more information is coming out, but ultimately exactly how they affect human health is also a critical factor. Kennedy will talk about this more, but in general, animal studies have found that when exposed to high levels of PFAS, there can be changes in certain parts of the body, from the liver to the thyroid, pancreas, and even hormone levels. There is movement at the federal level on this front. EPA has set maximum contaminant levels for certain PFAS in drinking water. GenX is one of them. These MCLs are being discussed by the new administration, and so we'll wait for further information on whether these maximum contaminant levels in drinking water change, and if they do, for which compounds. But they do present a challenge for regulatory agencies, understanding their behavior in the environment, and definitely human health impacts. Next slide, please. So when we walk back through some of the start of the work with Chemours at the Bladen County site, formerly DuPont, a lot of this started mid-2017 when the impacts to the Cape Fear River, downstream utilities, and other counties became aware of this issue. In middle of 2017, we discovered there were also, unfortunately, impacts to groundwater, and a lot of people in this area or greater region do utilize a groundwater source for their drinking water. Later in that year, 2017, we realized that PFAS had also unfortunately been emitted through air emission contributions. And leading into 2018 was testing of emissions from the plant, what was emitted out of the plant stacks, if you will, and the potential that that had impacted groundwater and drinking water wells. You fast forward a few years, and you'll often hear us refer to that legal document, the consent order, which governs a lot of the private well sampling, assessment for these PFAS, and ultimately the corrective action or the cleanup. That was a joint agreement between the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, who we work for, the Chemours company itself, and also Cape Fear River Watch. In 2019, one of the main sources of PFAS, which we'll talk about, was addressed through the installation of a thermal oxidizer, removing the compounds from being emitted through air emissions. And fast forward to where we are now, a lot of ongoing private well testing, which we want to talk with everyone about this evening, especially in the lower Cape Fear region, and the recent letters that were mailed out after Labor Day of this year. And that 2022 timeline is when a lot of this work started in the lower Cape Fear region itself. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the Chemours plant, once again, it's in Bladen County on the Cape Fear River. You see the plant production facility depicted here, the stacks giving you an idea of some of these PFAS unfortunately made their way into air emissions, came down, deposited through rainwater, or even as a dry depositional source, passed through the soil near the plant, Bladen County, Cumberland County, and impacted the underlying groundwater. There were also discharges. The blue line at the bottom represents the Cape Fear River that the plant sits next to. There were discharges from the plant itself through an old outfall area, meaning a discharge point of processed water, and also seeps, groundwater that actually surfaces at the Cape Fear River. And these different source areas were unfortunately impacted by PFAS and led to further impacts to the Cape Fear River. And this particular illustration shows you that overview before 2017, when some of the investigative and control work got underway. Next slide, please. So this illustration really focuses on groundwater testing, and one of the main sources we just touched on, PFAS making their way from the plant itself out through stacks, emitted to the environment, and coming down and impacting the soil, passing through the soil profile, and impacting underlying groundwater. The aerial photo shows you the Fayetteville work site where not only Chemours operates, but also a DuPont facility in Karari. It also shows you specific red dots and detections of these PFAS compounds in groundwater at the production facility. The Cape Fear River would be on the far right of that aerial photo. So we found high levels of PFAS in on-site groundwater monitoring wells. At the time, the Department of Health and Human Services had established a provisional health goal for Gen X at 140 part per trillion. In 2022, EPA established a nationwide health advisory for that PFAS compound Gen X at 10 ppt, which ultimately also was reflected earlier in the consent order. We conducted further testing of private properties around the Chemours plant that sourced their private well water from groundwater and asked Chemours to test additional wells in the area. And this work also, like the lower Cape Fear region, continues around the Bladen County plant. And in 2021, towards the end of the year, the department did state that Chemours is responsible for groundwater contamination of monitoring wells in the lower Cape Fear region, specifically New Hanover County and potentially other counties. So not only was there an air emission component to how these PFAS entered the environment, but they also entered the Cape Fear River through various sources and then ultimately impacted downriver counties. Next slide, please. So I won't touch on all of these bullets and details, but if you're not familiar with the consent order, that is the legally binding document that governs a lot of the private well sampling work, what remedial options are offered, meaning filters, water lines, what levels of PFAS dictate those different options. So please look at the consent order if you've never reviewed it or not familiar with the term. It does establish requirements to significantly reduce those air emissions from the plant over 99%, notifying downstream utilities if there's specific discharges of PFAS, and the third bullet, which we'll talk a lot about tonight, sampling of private wells and providing alternate water when these PFAS are discovered. And there's penalty provisions if Chemours fails to meet these conditions or deadlines. Next slide, please. And there was also an addendum. So when you look up the consent order, if you're not familiar with that legal document, it was also amended in 2020 to achieve additional controlled technology improvements, determine PFAS amounts in wastewater and stormwater that may be leaving the site, and determine what PFAS may be in river sediment and even raw water intakes for downriver drinking water plants, and to overall take specific actions to address more than 90% of the PFAS entering that critical surface water feature, meaning the Cape Fear River. Next slide, please. So this slide shows more where we are now. It's the same illustration with the Chemours plant on the upper part of the screen with those facility stacks showing you where there's now a red X. A thermal oxidizer has cut off those PFAS emissions to the air through depositional purposes. There's also a red X to the left of the stack area showing that the processed water is now shipped off-site. This processed water was making its way to the Cape Fear River. It had levels of PFAS that were impacting the river, and it's now hauled off-site for proper disposal. The red X down near the river, somewhat at the bottom left, is now showing a treatment system that treats PFAS before it enters the river. And then there are also seeps where that groundwater was entering the river. They're being addressed through a barrier wall and an extraction system, and were previously addressed through flow-through cells. And we'll talk briefly about these remedies a little more. But all of this is background information helping folks to understand, unfortunately, how these man-made compounds entered the river, entered the environment, and then potentially impacted private wells. Next slide, please. So this illustration, Jared may touch on it a little more also, but it gives you a good idea of when you have a production facility like Chemours in Bladen County, if those PFAS make their way out into air emissions, they can come down to the left of this slide through atmospheric deposition, through rainwater, or even through dry deposition. They then make their way into the soil through the soil profile, especially with rainwater, and then impact the underlying groundwater that private wells use for a drinking water source. And so the air emissions, the take-home message here, have been significantly lowered, with that thermal oxidizer achieving 99% facility-wide Gen X emissions reductions. Next slide, please. In this slide, we won't get into the details of it, but obviously as the state's regulatory programs, from air quality to waste management to water resources, we track these emissions and total deposition of that Gen X compound, which is specific to the Chemours plant in Bladen County, North Carolina. And the take-home message here is tracking over time from the 2018 all the way to where we are through 24, 25 of these Gen X emissions being stopped, the total deposition, meaning it entering the environment through the air emissions profile, being addressed through different remedial options. Next slide, please. So these I'll touch on just briefly, but going back to that illustration that now has the red X's on it, each one of these aerial photos will show you the actual treatment systems involved. So the Chemours plant, Greater Fayetteville Works, it's called Fayetteville Works because there's also a DuPont facility there, and Carrari, another company in addition to Chemours, operate near the Cape Fear River. And there was an old outfall area that had discharges that entered the Cape Fear River that had the PFAS compounds in them. There's now treatments at this old outfall area. The bottom photo shows you some of these carbon canisters that filter that flow and remove the PFAS before it enters the river. Next slide, please. In addition, we talked about the groundwater. Once again, the plant property on the left, the Cape Fear River on the right. There were a series of seeps, or where groundwater actually surfaces, looks like a flowing stream, and that stream then enters the Cape Fear River. And this groundwater, once again, under the plant, the production facility, had very high levels of PFAS and then was flowing into the river. So per the consent order, per the updated addendum, the additions to the consent order in 2020, Chemours had to install flow-through treatment, activated carbon that the groundwater would flow through. The carbon would then retain the PFAS before ultimately it was discharged to the river. And they were installed in late 2020 through early spring of 2021, and highly effective in treating that groundwater before it ultimately flowed more like a stream, meaning a surface water feature, to the river. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the remedy that has replaced the flow-through cells and one of the final solutions to the PFAS in the environment, besides the thermal oxidizer, which addressed the air emissions, has been this underground barrier wall that Chemours installed. And not only is it an underground wall, it's coupled with a well extraction system to remove groundwater. It's over 6,000 feet long, and in places up to 100 feet deep, completely underground, stopping groundwater from flowing directly into the Cape Fear River that often has very high levels of PFAS in it. It is approximately 36 inches wide and was installed in a one-pass installation, mixing soil, bentonite, cement, in a continuous construction process. A very large piece of equipment, looks very similar to a track hoe machine that has like a ditch witch or a ditching machine on the front of it, but at a very, very large scale in order to dig almost 100 feet deep in order to then form this wall. But that has successfully stopped groundwater from under the production facility reaching the river without being treated. Next slide, please. And coupled with that wall, the groundwater doesn't just impound behind it, it's actually removed with a series of extraction wells. So they're located along the wall length, and they extend even 1,000 feet beyond the wall to the north. And then force mains take that extracted groundwater to a treatment system that removes the PFAS before it's ultimately discharged. That way, the impacted groundwater under the facility is no longer flowing directly to the Cape Fear River and impacting that river water source. Next slide, please. So Jared will touch on this a little bit more also, but the part of the consent order and why we emphasize it this evening is really, once again, it's the framework, also the legal document that outlines when these PFAS are found, and Chemours has certain signature PFAS. There's 12 of them in the attachment at the end of the consent order. It's called Attachment C. That if they're detected, we'll give you those compounds, all of them in a slide in a minute, but if they're found at certain levels, usually 10 part per trillion or higher, or a summation of them, they will trigger alternate water. For those that, unfortunately, private wells that have the Gen X compound at or above 10 part per trillion, they will trigger a whole house filtration system, which we'll show you a picture of, or reverse osmosis, which is an undersink unit we will show you a picture of at every bathroom and kitchen sink. In some areas of the lower Cape Fear region, there's also municipal water that's readily available in front of your home or other property, and may also be an option for a connection rather than a filtration system. And if these compounds are found in totality or summation at levels above 70 part per trillion, then that can also trigger these alternate water provisions. So the take-home message, once again, the consent order governs this, but if the Chemours PFAS are found, if Gen X is 10 part per trillion or higher, whole house filtration or water lines can be available. If the other 11 PFAS are found at 10 part per trillion or higher in your well water, it will trigger up to 3 reverse osmosis systems. Or once again, if a water line's available, that may also be an option. So it's a lot of information, but once again, the consent order governs these types of options that are available if PFAS are detected. Next slide, please. So it is very important, as Heather touched on, there's been a lot of letters sent out. The first step is for folks to request their well to get sampled. The primary piece of information here is if the well is your primary source of drinking water. If you water a garden, you may water livestock or water your yard. That's really not the trigger point in the consent order. The well has to be your primary water supply. So if you're in that lower Cape Fear region, obviously Columbus, New Hanover, Pender, and Brunswick counties, we've got the phone number here again for you to call. Hopefully you also received a letter directly from Chemours, and we can also assist with any questions you have tonight or beyond tonight related to this well sampling. It is not Chemours conducting the sampling. It's a consultant, a licensed consultant by the name of Parsons. Usually it's Parsons Environment and Infrastructure that actually would come to your house and do the testing, not a Chemours employee. And then that data gets sent to Chemours, but also gets sent to us at the state with the Department of Environmental Quality. Next slide, please. So you may have seen a letter that looks like this. It usually comes from the plant manager. You can see his signature at the bottom, Seth Bailey. It will come on Chemours letterhead. It will give you contact information, may give you a QR code to scan, but it will also ask you that critical question. If you have a private well, is it your primary water supply? Meaning you're not connected to municipal water. It's where you get your drinking water to make your coffee, make your tea, piped into your kitchen sink, etc. Some people have a separate well to water their yard, which is understandable. Some people have a well and water their garden. The well that gets sampled under the consent order is the well if it's your primary source of drinking water. So the updates here, Chemours had previously sent out to this lower Cape Fear region Already over about 80,000 letters, an additional 14,000 went out after Labor Day. That's really why we're meeting this evening, to talk specifically about that, and the opportunity for folks to get their wells sampled. The well letters were sent out based on current information we have for homes that are near the Cape Fear River and its floodplain areas. Remember, we talked about the PFAS unfortunately entering that river. So if your well sources the groundwater close to that river or floodplain areas from the Cape Fear, it may be impacted and needs to be tested. We've also found that the water and sewer infrastructure in the Lower Cape Fear, where water was taken from the river, then treated and piped to homes as the utility infrastructure, once again, water lines and sewer lines, sometimes can leak, sometimes even ruptures. And in those instances, groundwater may have been impacted as PFAS were taken with river water, piped through utility systems, and then those systems do have the potential to leak or rupture at times. So that's another way how groundwater in the Lower Cape Fear may have been impacted. And there's also some areas where we know PFAS impacts have occurred. There's some areas where finished drinking water is pumped into underlying aquifers for like the summer season when there's higher water demands. And that stored water unfortunately had PFAS in it because it was once again sourced from the Cape Fear River. So these are some ways that the PFAS may have impacted private wells. But these letters describe the next steps, how to request your free sampling. And the last bullet on this slide does specifically give you the 12 PFAS beyond just Gen X that we've talked about this evening that can trigger alternate water if they're unfortunately found in your well water. And one of the compounds we do unfortunately see a lot in the Lower Cape Fear region, it is PFMOAA. So that's a compound you may not have heard a lot about. It is tied to Chemours, and we do see it in the Lower Cape Fear region. Next slide, please. So just some quick numbers. Jared's going to show you some great illustrations to really frame this for your respective region there in the Lower Cape Fear. But Chemours has reported to the state there's over 1,800 properties in this Lower Cape Fear region that now qualify for alternate water. So over 1,800 wells are eligible for some type of remedy. Connect to municipal water, obtain a filtration system. There's over 1,600 private wells that have one or more of the Chemours PFAS at or above 10 part per trillion. And those, or at a combined level at or above 70. So these are the residents that qualify for those under the sink, or what we call reverse osmosis filters. And we'll show you a picture of that. And it's important, as the third bullet notes, Chemours is required under the consent order to service, maintain these filtration systems for up to 20 years. It's like an oil filter on your car or an HVAC filter on your house. They do have to be maintained, and sometimes cartridges replaced on these filtration units. The fourth bullet, over 230 private wells have the Gen X compound at or above 10 part per trillion. And that's the trigger for whole house filtration. Also can allow you to be in the waterline connection conversation as well. And they, like a bullet says, qualify for that whole house filtration. So if a water line is feasible, the last bullet here, the maximum water bill amount under the consent order, Chemours is required to pay up to $75 a month for your water bill if your home is eligible for a municipal water connection. Next slide, please. And these are two pictures. When we talk about whole house filtration, you may hear the acronym GAC. That's granular activated carbon. That's a picture on the upper right-hand side. If you had Gen X in your well water at 10 part per trillion or higher, you would be eligible for this type of filtration system. Once again, you may also be eligible for municipal water if it's in your community. The two large canisters in the center contain the activated carbon that strips the PFAS out before it were to come in your home. The other two smaller filters to the left are typically iron and sediment filters before that well water flows through the activated carbon. The picture at the bottom is an under the sink reverse osmosis system, highly effective in removing PFAS. It removes it directly where you use the water. Your kitchen sink, your bathroom sink, bathroom next to your bedroom, that's where these are placed. We've tested both of these at the state level. We have our own analytical data. We're not dependent on Chemours to test these systems. We know they're highly effective in removing these man-made compounds. Next slide, please. So for alternate water, if your well gets sampled, we really encourage you to inquire about getting it sampled. And if you decide to do that and it's your primary source of drinking water and you're in this region and received a letter, or just call Chemours because you didn't receive a letter and they agreed to come out and sample your well, then that data can take a few weeks, 4 to 6 weeks to receive it. If you trigger, unfortunately, have PFAS in the well water at or above those 10 part per trillion thresholds or the 70 part per trillion threshold we discussed, you will receive most likely what we call a voucher card within just a few days. This is like a debit or a credit card, but it's paid for by Chemours, where you can go to your local grocery store, wherever you would buy drinking water or other beverages, and actually buy water on this card. That way you can buy the type of water, the size container of water you need. But it's meant to be a very, very short-term fix before you're offered either a filter, or if we have municipal water in your neighborhood, you may be eligible for a connection to that municipal water line versus continuing to use your private well, which may have the PFAS in it. Next slide, please. So we do have a lot of online resources. We've talked a good bit about the consent order. We have some frequently asked questions, information about the filtration systems, and even some translated documents if folks need those. So some great web-related resources here. Next slide, please. So next steps, we are continuing the sampling, New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, and Columbus counties, the private well sampling. That's why the letters were sent out after Labor Day for additional areas in the region. Please share recommendations on making this well testing information available to your community. The first step is definitely for homeowners to pursue this free well testing option, and also continuing to look at municipal water connections in the regions. There's been a lot of activity with CFPUA, Brunswick County, the other utilities trying to connect people to municipal water where we can. And there's also in the region additional environmental assessment, meaning beyond private wells, evaluating where these PFAS are, what next steps are needed to address any other PFAS in the environment besides private wells. Next slide, please. That's it for me. So really appreciate everyone attending this evening. And I believe Jared's going to follow up with more detailed information on the Lower Cape Fear private well sampling. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Questions that are submitted through the chat will be addressed after the presentations. And the next presentation will be an explanation of the expanded sampling area presented by Jared Wilson.
Thank you, Heather. And thanks, Michael, for the great introduction. As Michael discussed, there's been a long sampling program that's been going on under the Chemours sampling program for both the near site and the 4-county area. And today I'm going to discuss a bit of the expansions that you may have seen over the past year. This is the most recent one that we're going to discuss primarily today. So next slide, please. So one of the main reasons why this is such a difficult task is 35% of all residents in North Carolina obtain their drinking water from private wells. And that's not evenly distributed, and that makes the whole sampling program a bit tricky when navigating. So I'll start first. Next slide, please. I'll start first with discussing the near-site sampling approach and the changes that were implemented earlier this year. And so previously, under the original drinking water plan, it was done in a very stepwise approach. So, and that got more than 10,000 samples collected from private wells in the counties directly around the facility. This was the stepwise approach, as I mentioned. They would in a sector mile would collect 10 exploratory samples, and if no homes qualify for water treatment, they would sample 10 more confirmatory samples, and if there are homes that do qualify for water treatment, then they would step out to the next mile, and this process would repeat itself. That led to sampling continuing up to 27.5 miles away from the facility. Next slide, please. But it came with its own hurdles, because as those steps got further and further from the facility, those sector miles became larger and larger. As I mentioned, even though we have a large number of residents in North Carolina that use private wells as their primary source of drinking water, that density of the private wells in a given area may vary depending on any number of factors, whether it's public water availability in the area, much more rural areas, they're going to be more likely to be on wells, but when they're more rural, there might be fewer homes in a given sector mile. So achieving those goals became a bit more difficult. Next slide, please. So we worked with Chemours and some of their consultants, and we developed a two-pronged approach. So model one was it took all the samples and accounted for all the samples that were within a given area and estimated within a given area, and then increased 10% beyond that current sampling area. So that was the first model that was implemented. Next slide, please. Model two then measured the rate of exceedance in each sector mile to estimate where we would expect 0% of the homes would qualify for water. So there's two different models working together. And then next slide, please. What that developed is a conservative approach utilizing both models and taking the farthest of the two to estimate where the projected delineation boundary would be. This is a projection, and as always, models are based on and more useful the more data that we have. So the projection is in the process of being evaluated to with the new data to determine the efficiency of the models and adjust the distance as needed. So next slide, please. Looking down to the 4-county area, as Michael talked about, there were several hypotheses for how PFAS were distributed in that area. So whether it's public water service line leaks from the Cape Fear River water, direct injection or application of contaminated river water, so irrigation, the aquifer recharges, or water distributed from the Cape Fear into the surrounding floodplain, and biosolids or land application areas. These were all tested for under the 4 counties assessment report that Chemours submitted September of last year. Next slide, please. So originally under the initial drinking water plan for the 4-county area, this included the Cape Fear River floodplain, a 1/4-mile buffer around most of the public water service lines, and then an additional 1/4-mile buffer around all the exceedances in the 4-county area. Next slide, please. In 2023, this was evaluated, and we added an additional portion of the floodplain boundary to include more of the tributaries. It updated the 1/4-mile buffer around public water service lines, and you can see some of the changes there in Columbus County. Also updated the 1/4-mile buffer around all the exceedances that had been sampled for in the area, and included a 1/4-mile buffer around all the biosolid land application fields. Next slide, please. So the culmination of that 4-county assessment report that was submitted, several of the hypotheses were supported by the data. And because of that, a delineation boundary was developed based on the information presented in those hypotheses. And that's that purple boundary there that you see in the map on the right-hand side of the page. Next slide, please. So, or I'm sorry, can you go back one more slide? So the floodplain hypothesis was one of the hypotheses that were supported. And as many of you may have noticed that, there is a portion of the floodplain that exists that is outside of this 4-county area. So now we can go to the next slide. And that's an expansion that you see there in pink. So this is that carryover from that 4-county assessment into the Bladen County floodplain. And so this is that 55-mile stretch through Bladen County. These folks were now eligible for sampling as well. Next slide, please. So moving forward, the updates to the drinking water compliance plan now include the Table 3 plus delineation boundary that was drawn based on the 4-county assessment work that was done. And now residents that are within that boundary that was created are now also eligible. So next slide, please. So the overall expansion from much of the effort that's gone into this includes more than double the sampling area near site. The Bladen County floodplain buffer was also added, and all the homes that are in the Table 3 plus delineation boundary. And in total, is estimated that more than 30,000 additional homes across 10 counties are eligible for private well sampling now. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. This is kind of some of the same information that Michael had at the end of his slide. We're going to continue the private well sampling in Bladen, Cumberland, Sampson, Robeson, Harnett, and Hope counties, including the sampling expansion in New Hanover, Pender, and Brunswick and Columbus counties. Continue those discussions with county officials and health departments, and continue evaluating the models to make sure that they are the most protective of public health. And with that, I will pass it off to Kennedy.
Thank you, Jared, for sharing that information. Remember to please submit your questions through the chat, and the next presentation will be on the health impacts related to PFAS presented by Kennedy Holt. And Kennedy, you are muted.
Thanks for that. Sorry. So hello again, everyone. I'm Kennedy Holt. I'm the environmental toxicologist with North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And we're to go through some of the health-related information to PFAS, and then also some of the resources we developed to answer some of the key questions we've gotten from those in impacted communities. Next slide, please. So just to kind of frame up what I'm going to talk about here. So some of the main questions we get from those impacted by these chemicals are, what are the health impacts related to PFAS? Is my water safe to drink? Is it safe to garden and eat produce that I use my well water for that could have these chemicals in it? And also, because of the impacts to Cape Fear River, that we received a lot of questions about, is it safe to eat fish and use that for food in this area? So next slide, please. So to start out with, so PFAS, unfortunately, there are a lot of health effects that can be associated with these chemicals. And it can also impact pregnant women and children more so than the average adult population. And so just to kind of go through some of the key health impacts that we see in the literature is there are increases to cholesterol, there's decreased vaccine response in children or decreased immune system efficiency. There's changes in liver enzymes and liver toxicity that is seen from exposure to these chemicals. There's increases in blood pressure and preeclampsia in pregnant women is seen. There's also decreases in birth weights and potential preterm birth effects that are associated with PFAS exposures. And then also there's associations with cancer, so kidney, testicular cancer, breast cancer are some of the ones that are commonly associated with PFAS exposures. Next slide, please. So going off those health effects here, so going back to trying to minimize exposures from these chemicals, again, as Michael pointed out, if you do have high levels of these chemicals in there, there are treatment options available, but for some of these systems, they don't necessarily treat all the water that's in the house. So some of the questions we've got revolve around gardening with this water. And so we've worked with scientists at NC State who have done research in gardens impacted in these areas, and also gone through the literature and developed a best practices fact sheet for gardening that goes through crops that are more susceptible or take up more PFAS than others, and provide that information, and then also provided tips and guidance about how to reduce PFAS getting into your produce. Next slide, please. Related to fish, we have also worked with the Department of Environmental Quality and the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission to look at fish in the Cape Fear River region, looking at the impact of these chemicals in fish and how much of these chemicals has gotten into fish. And so we have done extensive testing in collaboration with these two agencies to determine this. And unfortunately, we did find elevated levels of these chemicals, particularly PFOS. So that's PFOS that we have seen that high levels of in various fish species in the Cape Fear River. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, because there are differences in how these chemicals impact the general population and pregnant women, children, we have developed fish advisories for these fish that have elevated levels and for both groups of the population here. And so as you can see here, for the general population, bluegill sunfish, flathead catfish, largemouth bass, red ear sunfish, and striped bass, we recommend not eating more than 1 meal a year of these fish if they were caught within the Cape Fear River. And for fish such as the American shad, blue catfish, and channel catfish, we recommend not eating more than 7 meals per year of these fish if they were caught in the Cape Fear River. And one thing I just want to make clear is these are recommendations. These are not laws, regulations, or anything. So this is just based on what we're seeing in the river and the fish. These are our recommendations, and so, but these are nobody's that come out, and if you are catching or eating more, nobody's that cite you or give you any guff about that. It's just we just want to again provide information so people can make choices for themselves and their families. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the other things is to kind of tie all of this together too. So with the health impacts here, while we are able to explain to folks what potential health impacts, but maybe one of the things that we have gotten feedback about is that when talking with their healthcare providers, there's some healthcare providers are not necessarily familiar with these chemicals and don't know enough, really a lot about them to make informed decisions. So we've actually developed what we call our PFAS clinician memo, which is a document specifically addressed to healthcare providers that goes through some of the basics of these chemicals, but it also provides guidance developed by the National Academies for Science that has looked at PFAS and those health impacts that are most common and commonly associated with exposure to these chemicals. And so it goes through that and helps to provide the clinician more guidance in terms of routine of care for folks that have concerns about exposures to PFAS. And we developed this in both English and Spanish as well. And then also one of the things too, as my colleagues at DEQ have mentioned, that the consent order is tailored specifically for PFAS that have been associated with the Chemours facility. One thing we have seen, unfortunately, is that there are other PFAS that have been detected in wells across the region. And so in response to that, we've worked to develop what we call our PFAS testing and treatment fact sheet, which for those that don't fall within the bounds of the consent order, it provides contact information for private labs that can do PFAS testing along the same suite of chemicals that is being tested for through the consent order. And also we've pulled information from researchers from both Duke and NC State that have researched treatment options that are effective at removing PFAS. So if someone didn't qualify for a treatment system through the consent order, we have compiled information on treatment systems that are effective at removing these PFAS, as shown by research done at NC State and Duke universities. Next slide, please. So some of the other things that we are still working on at DHHS is we are still engaging with academic partners and other agencies to understand the true extent of this issue and to keep up with ongoing research in terms of the health impacts and understanding all these other different chemicals that are coming from this facility. Some are better studied than others, and we're still learning about them. So we're trying to make sure that we're engaged with our academic partners and researchers to be able to provide the best information to folks. We are still working with communities throughout the Cape Fear region and community groups to help with outreach and health education regarding these topics, to make sure that people are informed and know steps they can take to help mitigate their exposures. And then we're still working with colleagues at DEQ and the Wildlife Resource Commission to evaluate additional areas of the Cape Fear River region for further fish consumption advisories as well, because that has been a topic of interest amongst community members. Next slide, please. And with that, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Kennedy. That was a lot of helpful information. Now we will transition to the Q&A panel. You've already met our panelists, Michael Scott, Jared Wilson, and Kennedy Holt. Thus far, we have not received any questions. So maybe to give folks a few minutes to think and to type something into the chat box, I'll just ask a question to start with. Jared, can you talk a little bit about the potential that these expanded areas could shrink?
So at no point in any of the sampling process, if Chemours has offered sampling, they wouldn't roll it back. That said, the delineation boundaries are pretty strong in terms of where we believe the extent is, at least as far as we understand the data. But as far as data is concerned, it's only bolstered by more data. And so as far as, I think Michael mentioned it, the only way we can really know more about the true extent is having folks get their wells sampled. We certainly need, we have a response rate of approximately 40% in the 4-county area. And it's not quite that near site. So it's certainly something that we want to, have, more people getting their wells sampled if they're eligible.
Thank you, Jared. And I heard you talk about the response rate. Michael, I didn't know if you'd like to expand on that.
Yeah, one of the key components is definitely a take-home message this evening is, for folks to request to get their well sampled. Once again, it needs to be your primary drinking water source. But still, if we're in a 40% response rate, there's a lot of people that may be eligible for the free well testing, even folks that may unfortunately have these compounds in their well water. and we would want to get that analytical data back. If that's unfortunately the case, then make sure, those homeowners are provided alternate water, and then ultimately a solution through filtration or water line connection. And Heather, I think we did have a couple of questions that are popping in now. I don't know if you can see them, or I just pulled them up. I can read them. The first one can pitch in on, but Jared can probably field.
And I do not see the questions.
I'll read it. So the first question, Jared, maybe you and I tag team this one if you want to start. The question is, how were the persons chosen who received the letters, or how how were folks identified, Jared, in the initial round or the second round? I guess we can speak to both. So how were folks identified that were sent the letters?
So originally there was the process. You may have had the homeowners or the door knocks and everything that were going out in the near site. That wasn't the most fruitful and best use of resources. And what Chemours wound up doing was evaluating properties based on homes that exist within the property boundary. That's where the letter goes out, and so that's the drinking water. The exact name is eluding me right now, but that's the letter that was sent out because they're requesting information if you have a private well and it's your primary source of drinking water. That's the initial. If it is, and if you do qualify for drinking, then you will get sampled. That's the letter. So basically, in the most recent expansion, the 14,000 homes that we were talking about earlier, every one of those 14,000 residents would have gotten a letter in the mail.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. So, just in summary, what Jared's conveyed, and we've tried to touch on this evening, the main hypotheses or the basis for well sampling in the lower Cape Fear region is tied to impacts from the Cape Fear River. So if you live near the river, live near the floodplain area of the river, or for most of the region, if you live close to a water and sewer line infrastructure where the water from the river was conveyed through those underground pipes, they do leak. They do have complete ruptures at times. And that is another potential source of how the river water went through underground utility lines, may have leaked, impacted groundwater, and then we have neighborhoods that may not be served by those water lines, but they're in close proximity to them. So those are some of the theories and basis for how people were chosen to receive letters. The follow-up question is a good one. If wells were previously sampled 3 years ago, can they be retested? And this is often a common question. And Jared, you may want to weigh in too. Chemours has recently updated us on some well retesting they're doing in the lower Cape Fear region. So the answer is wells are being retested, but it's a very small subset. It is not all the wells get tested a second time. So once again, there's some retesting, but it's a limited amount of wells. We do have folks that sometimes request DEQ to retest wells. We really have limited funding. We have to focus on people who have never had their well tested. So if you're concerned and want to get a well retested, you could always ask us if we're in the area, would it be possible? It may not be, as we're trying to focus on wells that have never been tested. Then your other option would be to utilize the laboratory list that Kennedy touched on. We do have labs and filter options, fact sheets where people can take their own sample. The downside is, yes, that there is a cost for this analysis. Jared, did you want to say anything else about the retesting question? Because it is a good one.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on it. I think it is, originally the plan, was set out and it was a limited number of resamples each year. But yeah, they are planning on updating that resampling program, and when we get an update on what that looks like, we will, definitely share that with the community.
All right. Were there any other questions?
Michael,
So,
I think
go ahead.
I was gonna say I don't think anybody else in chat right now is able to see the questions, but you.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so we may need to clarify. We've had one more question, so I can touch on it, but we may want to clarify. I am seeing them, so we're getting the questions. That's fine. It's just that the whole panel can't see them. We'll go ahead and answer this one, and then we can clarify any more questions if they're showing up in the other chat. It is a question about a concern about our reference to being close to the river. This community member lives near the Shalote River, which flows in the intercoastal waterway. Then the Cape Fear River flows into. They are concerned about the impacts of contamination and how long these PFAS and other chemicals remain in the ground. So, Jared, you may want to start. I know you've looked a lot at the tributaries and not just the Cape Fear River, but it sounds like the question is there's a concern, with our references to living close to the river. I think the message is, make sure you get your well tested. If you've not done that, that would be the main focus this evening. But Jared, did you want to touch on any of the references here to some of the other water bodies that flow into the Cape Fear?
So we have the purple table 3+ delineation boundary is fairly conservative, which means it encompasses a large portion of the tributaries in the area, and the Shalote River does fall within that table 3+ boundary. I'm fairly sure. I don't have a map right in front of me, but I'm fairly certain that it does. And so just in that instance, like I said, the only thing that we can do is if you're concerned about your well, and you do fall within that table 3+ area, if you're eligible for sampling, by all means, please reach out and have your well sampled. The only thing that we need data to make informed decisions, and if the data is not there, we can't make those decisions without it. So.
Thank you, Jared. And Kennedy, maybe you could speak to this, but I think the other part of this question is just overall concerns with living close to the river, a waterway. We've touched on how these PFAS may be in the river, but Kennedy, do you want to maybe speak to the direct exposure routes? We've talked a lot about private wells, but sounds like there's concerns, with surface water features or just living near the river. Kennedy, I don't know if maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. So regarding living in proximity to surface water body, there is not, I'll say there's not a lot of literature on it in terms of studying that proximal exposure. I'll say just based on what we know about these chemicals, it's unlikely in terms of how water usually flows, at least near facilities. Typically, the rivers don't leach into groundwater. Typically, that's not typical how that occurs. And so I would not expect that. The major impact I would expect from being located in proximity to a river is if you were to go into a river that has these chemicals, you could be exposed. However, based again on the current science, the exposure via the dermal route, so the route where you're coming into contact with these chemicals, is fairly low compared to drinking water exposure, so ingestion or inhalation exposures. And so when it comes to these waters, the concentrations that I have seen in the data that DEQ has collected for the river generally, those levels of these these PFAS chemicals are not at the levels where, based on what we currently know, are of a high level of concern. Not saying that the exposure doesn't occur, but just based on what we currently know, it seems like a very low level exposure compared to these other routes. And as Michael pointed out too, at least from the air emissions exposure with the thermal oxidizer that's there, that route has been significantly curbed as well. And so as far as what we know of as exposure routes in these areas, it really is the drinking water exposure is where we're seeing a lot of the primary exposures currently still in this area. So if you do get your water tested, that's definitely the right step. And if unfortunately these compounds are found there, as they've said, hopefully you could be eligible for a treatment system. And if not, we have those resources that can point you to other treatment options as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kennedy. So we did have one follow-up regarding this particular property owner has not received a letter, and others on the road have not either. So this is one we definitely can follow up on. Jared showed the outlined region across the 4 counties, New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, and Columbus, where private well sampling is offered. So if you're in that boundary, you're definitely eligible to speak with Chemours about the sampling. Once again, the main piece being if a private well is your primary source of drinking water. So we'll definitely look into this and try to understand why maybe this particular area did not receive letters. There was also a follow-up question on where testing is performed at, as far as the kitchen sink or at the well. I will just say it's a question we often get. The sample does not have to be taken directly at the well head. Sometimes we as the state sample there, but it can be taken, not at the well head. We don't want to take a sample where we know under the house there's already a filtration system or some other type of treatment on the well water, but it does not always have to be taken at the well head to be a valid result. So we'll definitely follow up on this one regarding the concern that these folks in this particular area may not have received letters, and did ask them just to reach out to us. It can be after this call or place in the chat, a particular street name or address so we can look directly into that. Back to you, Heather.
Heather, you're on mute.
I was on a roll. Thank you. So we will now wrap up this session. As a reminder, residences within the expanded area where well water is your primary source of drinking water and would like your well tested, please call Chemours at 910-678-1100. If you have additional questions that were not answered during the session, please send those to publicaffairs@deq.nc.gov. For more information, a recording of this information session and responses to questions, please visit the website shown and scroll down almost to the bottom of the page and select the Community Updates tab. This concludes tonight's information session. We appreciate your time, attention, and thoughtful questions. Thank you.